The whole thing happened back in summer 2016. My parents go on holidays quite often, and I used to stay home alone for 2 weeks at the time to look after our dogs and take care of the garden in general. I've always been a bit of a scaredy cat due to my experiences with being harassed and followed home alone a couple of times. My neighborhood was relatively new at the time, so the whole thing was surrounded by forests, and oftentimes you could come across some junkies lurking in the forest while walking home from shops. However, despite that, I usually felt very safe in my house, staying with 4 big dogs and all. Nothing would ever really happen since most of my neighbors were my dad's friends who were all in the army. For some reason, it gives this odd sense of safety cause who would be stupid enough to try and break in the area like that. Oddly enough, during that particular summer, a couple of break-ins happened on my street, but my parents still decided to leave me home alone, reassuring me I have nothing to worry because I have my dogs, and our house is surrounded by a big fence. My fence has little spikes on top, so it's almost impossible to jump across it without hurting yourself. So, first couple of days were fine. Nothing weird happened except some thuds I heard in my garden, but thought nothing of it since usually it was just martins causing some mischief in my mom's flowers. It would happen so often that even my dogs would ignore it at that point. 2 days passed, and I finally have to leave for shops, but do loads of stuff to do throughout the day. I had to go in the evening when it was getting slightly dark outside. I went shopping, got my stuff, and would walk back home through my usual path. People would usually walk their dogs there, so it was quite busy in the evening because it was something in between a park and a forest. I was just casually walking, minding my own business, texting someone on my phone when I noticed that some guy I passed suddenly stood up from the bench and started walking behind me, but again thought maybe it's someone from my neighborhood that I don't recognize and he's just walking in the same direction as me. So I exit the forest into a normal road where houses start. I live right at the end of it. Guy's still walking behind me. I still think that maybe he lives in one of these houses, but nope. I get to the last junction where my house is. Guy is still behind me, and at this point I know he's not one of my neighbors, so my blood runs cold. Luckily, my neighbor who lives to the left of my house was outside watering his plants and spotted me as I was walking by and started talking to me. So the guy who was walking behind me immediately noticed it and just started running away again towards the forest, which ultimately gave me creeps. He was clearly following me to my house. I called my parents to tell them that it happened, but again, they told me I have nothing to worry about. Our neighborhood is safe. I had my dogs with me and so on and so on. I tried to calm down and go on with my things as usual. Whenever my parents are out of town, I sleep in their bedroom downstairs, since I don't want my dogs to walk the stairs in the dark and possibly hurt themselves. That night, as usual, I was laying in bed, reading a book, my dogs already soundly sleeping in bed with me. I suppose they could sense I was distressed because they usually sleep on the floor around the bed. I heard a thud coming from outside, like a little thud on the window in the room next to mine. Again, thought it's just martins, but this one time my dog started growling at the window in my bedroom. Couple seconds of silence, another thud, this time on window in my bedroom. That already made me panic, but I tried to stay calm nonetheless. However, the third got louder, each coming from windows on the ground floor. Someone was banging on every window of my house, making my dogs go absolutely crazy, running around the house wherever the bangs were coming from. At that point, I was in tears, knowing exactly what's happening, so I got out of my bedroom and walked to the center of my house where I can see the main door. And here's the thing, my main door has a window in it so you can see inside. I sat down in the darkness, couple feet away from the door, waiting, hoping and praying that someone will get scared of my dogs barking. But nope, I wasn't this lucky. First, I see my dogs rushing to the door, barking at it before there's anything there, but then I see a black silhouette outside my main door peeking inside and then banging on the little window as I'm sitting there helpless. I moved out of sight, hiding under the table, and got my phone out as I'm still hearing that man trying to break the glass. I called my dad, barely being able to breathe. He didn't pick up. Right, it was like 2 a.m. and they were on holidays. I tried 2 more times until my mom picked up, very confused why I'm calling in the middle of the night. I managed to spit out, "Someone is trying to break in, I don't know what to do." At that point, the man was trying to open the door, banging with his whole body on the frame to the point where my mom could hear it on the call. My dad was frantically trying to call everyone who could come and help me, his brother, my neighbors, my grandma. Everyone was put in a full mobility at that very moment to come here as fast as they could. My neighbor, the same one who spoke to me earlier that day, was the first one to come outside and scare the guy away. He rushed to my garden, but I was still too afraid to open the main door, despite the fact I could see the neighbor standing in front of it. I knew that man was still on my property, but back of the garden was pitch black, and my neighbor didn't want to risk going there on his own and getting potentially knocked out with something heavy. 10 minutes later, my uncle, aunt, and grandma pull up to my house, and I can see them all outside. My uncle had a key, so he opened the door, letting my dogs outside so they could chase after the intruder. My dogs are hunting dogs, so they're not cute little puppies for strangers. I will never forget how my grandma and aunt approached me when I was clinging onto the chair, absolutely in tears, as my mom was trying to figure out what's happening on the call. The man escaped through the back of the garden into my other neighbor's garden, I'm guessing trying to get away from my dogs, but he was finally gone. He did manage to damage the little window in my main door. The glass was already slightly cracked. Door itself got loose on the door hinges. I don't want to think about what could have happened if they didn't get to my house that quickly. My two brothers and I lived with my mom. I'm the oldest of the three, and my mom generally relied on me to get things done. This naturally turned me into an adult from a very early age. Even to this day, my mom talks about feeling guilty for having to thrust adulthood on me so early on. She thinks that I didn't have a childhood. Maybe she's right. As you might imagine, my dad wasn't really in the picture. He was an abusive drunk. And when I say abusive, I mean seriously abusive. Up until the time I was 10, he lived with us, and whenever he would get drunk, he would beat the living crap out of us. It was always terrifying. The only saving grace was the fact that he wasn't always drunk or had alcohol in the house. In fact, there were sometimes months at a time when he would go without drinking, and he was an otherwise pretty decent person. For all that was wrong with my dad, he would have probably been close to an ideal human being, if it had not been for his rampant alcoholism and the demon inside of him that came out when he got drunk. The incident that got my mom to finally divorce him was horrendous. I had been in my room playing video games or something, and he was in the living room. My mom had just gotten home from getting groceries. He accused her of having an affair at the time, and of course this wasn't true, but he didn't believe it. He kept screaming at her that she was lying. It escalated to the point that he pinned her down on the floor and said that he saw her nose growing and then grabbed a screwdriver and cut into my mom's nose with it. There is still a scar from that day. Well, that all went down when I was about 10, so this was about 5 years later. My mom was bringing my two younger brothers on some kind of Boy Scout trip. They were both in the Boy Scouts and always felt left out because all the other kids had a dad. My mom's guilt drove her to volunteer and help out whenever she could. So she went with my two brothers for this weekend camping trip with the Boy Scouts. She really wanted me to go with them because she felt uncomfortable having me alone in the house. I insisted that I was mature enough to do it, and honestly, I didn't even have friends that I could party with if I wanted to. She eventually gave in and let me have my way. I remember being in my bedroom playing my PlayStation. It was a pretty typical Saturday afternoon, but then I heard a car pull up. I didn't know who it was at first, and I immediately got really panicked that I was going to have to call the cops. My bedroom window doesn't have a really good view of the driveway, so it took me a second, but after studying the part of the car that I could see, I recognized it as my father's car. I was immediately mortified. I was on bad terms with him, and my mom had a really serious restraining order put on him after they had separated. I got really nervous, and I was not sure what to do. He didn't come into the house for a few minutes, and I immediately started wondering what he was up to. I did the only thing that I could think of and cracked my window so I could hear what was going on outside. I thought that if I could hear what he was doing, I would have a better idea. I immediately recognized that he was crying. His whimpering sounded really intense. I hadn't heard from him in years, and my mom said that we would never see him again. But here he was, crying in our driveway. He paced around for a few more minutes before finally standing still. I could hear his crying get louder. Then he screamed, "Pop!" All I heard was a gunshot. The second that I heard the gunshot, I immediately knew what had happened. I ran outside anyway. I looked down at my father's lifeless body on the driveway cement. Blood everywhere. As traumatic as it may have been, I didn't cry. I didn't act emotional or anything. I just called the police. They got there a few minutes later and took me into custody. They wanted to keep me safe and secure until they could contact my mom. The rest of the story played out exactly as you would imagine. My mom apologized profusely. I had to answer some questions for the police. Nothing out of the ordinary. I don't really know what to make of the situation. I don't have much sympathy for the guy. Part of me is kind of happy that he killed himself. But looking back, I just kind of wish that he had done it where I wouldn't have had to be a witness. The entire experience made me never want to stay home by myself ever again. It's been a long time since this whole thing had gone down, and even now, if I have to stay home by myself, I will make an effort to leave the house or invite a friend over. I won't stay there alone. A couple of years have passed since this entire situation, and I can't help but think that it was all for the better. My dad was a seriously destructive human being, and I know this might sound horrible, but I wish that he killed himself sooner. For those out there who haven't lived with a toxic and negative parental figure, consider yourself extremely lucky. The tribulations that I had to endure at the hands of my father fostered a lot of rage inside of me. My girlfriend and I had been living in our new apartment approximately 3 or 4 months at the time of this story. For clarification and background, we live in a basement-level unit. The one and only entrance is inside the building and down the stairs. However, there's 4 windows facing nothing but a row of shrubbery and tree line. It was roughly 10 p.m. She was at work for the evening, and I had the place to myself. Lights on and TV blasting, I was sitting in the living room planning on eating trashy and binge-watching the remaining episodes of Broad City. Not long into it, however, I heard a scraping sound from the bathroom. My first thought, a mouse? Which was the last thing we needed. So I get up and make my way through the hallway as quietly as I can to catch a glimpse of it. The closer I got, the more I realized the scratching wasn't coming from the bathroom, but rather the window in the master bedroom. My next guess was it's simply kids playing outside, as they tend to, or the bunny I had seen bouncing out there that morning. Even more likely someone taking a dog out to pee. I paused, tried to hone my hearing, and only then noticed it wasn't a sound echoing from outside, but rather scratching on the window itself. I started into the bedroom when I noticed the sound stopped and moved to the adjacent window in the room next to it. A smaller bedroom that gave us the creeps as is. We never used it, there's no light source, it simply sits dark and empty aside from a few boxes of my clothing. Now thinking back, it was probably a bad idea. I had hoped upon being discovered that whomever it was, obvious to me now that it was a someone, not a something, would run off. I had caught him red-handed, so I steeled myself and yelled out, "I hear you! What do you want?" The scratching stopped instantly. I waited. After what felt like an eternity, I assumed the coast was clear. I made my way to the windowsill and slowly cracked open the blinds. I don't know why I did. Because there he crouched, peering into me with the widest and wildest eyes I've ever seen on a person. Most certainly strung out on something. He told me to let him in. As shocked as I was, I almost laughed at the audacity, as if I was just going to swing open the window and let him in. Using the remaining courage I had mustered, I tell him not so gently, "No, get the fuck away from my house." He again told me to let him in, to which I informed him I was calling the police and hurriedly proceeded to do just that. I even turned the phone to face him for added effect. Unfortunately, it had the exact opposite effect. He was seething, raging, and practically foaming at the mouth. He drew back and punched the window, repeatedly slamming his fists and palms against the glass. The window started cracking, blood flinging up like a gore-filled movie effect. I was out of there fast, heart racing, slamming the door shut behind me. So tempted to run out the front door, but incredibly scared that he would just come around the front of the building. It would take no time at all for him to do. Torn and trapped, I pick up the nearest blunt object and placed myself in between the 2 doors. I figured whichever one moved first, I'd go out the other. I still had the phone to my ear, urging the 911 operator to get someone here fast. In my panicked state, I also feared for my girlfriend who would be coming home soon. I messaged her warning her about what was going on. Eventually, sirens and a pounding came to the front door. The police had arrived. I explained what had happened, and they searched the apartment and area near the window, coming back with a set of keys that he had possibly dropped, but no sign of him other than the broken window. They took a sample from the blood splatter on what was left of the glass. My girlfriend came home shortly after, having left work early and calling the police herself. I'm grateful she did. Maintenance had been notified and they threw up temporary boarding until it could be repaired. They never actually found the guy. Or if they did, I never received any updates about it. Definitely didn't get any sleep that night.
The story happened about 3 months ago in January, and it still really creeps me out to this day. I'm 17 years old, and my mom and stepdad had left me home alone for 6 days, as they had planned a trip to Mexico to celebrate their wedding anniversary. I was having so much fun being home alone. I was going out and partying pretty much every day without my parents ever knowing. I should also mention that my mom had actually hid her car keys from me, but obviously I had found them. I was also driving around and seeing my girlfriend at the time as well. There was one night where I drove to her house. She lived about 20 minutes away from me, and it really wasn't a very safe area. It was also a school night, but I'd stayed at her house until about 1 a.m. Well, as I was headed back home, I began to notice a car that was following me. I managed to lose them when I took a back way home though. Once I got home, I took a shower, and it was almost 2 a.m. at this point, but my dogs were barking really loudly and aggressively. They usually never bark like that. Well, I start looking through the blinds to see what the hell's going on outside to cause them to bark this much. As I peeked through the blinds, I saw a black car outside. What the f? I say to myself, that's the same exact car that was following me earlier. As you can imagine, I start to internally freak out. I then see 2 people walk through my backyard. I run and lock all of the doors and windows, and I close the curtains. I then heard a voice of what sounded like an older man, and he had a very deep voice. What I heard him say still gives me chills to this day. It sounded like he was on the phone with someone. This is how the conversation went. Yeah, we're here. The parents are gone. I think it's a young boy here. If I had to guess, he's around 17 to 18 years old. Yeah, don't worry. We're gonna try and take him soon. I then hear them trying to open every door and window, all the while my dogs continue to bark inside my room with me. Then, something clicked in my head. I have an older next door neighbor who's very big into guns and home protection. I knew if I was able to get his attention, he'd help me. I then zoomed to the front door, ran outside, and started screaming and banging on my neighbor's door, telling him everything that's happened thus far. Now, you would probably think by now these guys would either 1, be gone by now, or 2, at least made it inside the house. But no, these idiot criminals were still in my backyard. So anyways, I go with my neighbor to my backyard with him carrying a gun, and the guys are there, to which my neighbor then proceeds to scream his ass off at them, pointing his gun at them, and telling them they have 5 seconds to get the fuck off the property, or he's going to blast them. Also, I wanted to mention that there was 3 of them, which I didn't know before while I was still in the house. They all then proceeded to book it out of the backyard, then got into their car and drove off. But not before my neighbor got their license plate, then called the cops on their asses. I'm still to this day so fucking grateful for my neighbor David for doing what he did for me that night, as I truly have no idea what would have happened to me if he didn't come help me. Side note, for anyone wondering why I didn't just call the cops myself that night, well, the reason's pretty simple. I didn't want to get my parents in any kind of trouble, or have them find out about that experience and then I get in trouble. So yeah, they still don't know that it happened, and my neighbor David hasn't said anything either. Thank God. Still though, I cannot believe 3 strange men tried to kidnap a teenage boy. You usually hear about this stuff happening to girls very often, but boys? Not so much. Anyways, that's my story. I'm forever grateful to my neighbor David for helping me out that night. Seriously. Thank God for him. My story is a hard one to tell, but I really need to get it off my chest. My name is Alexander. I'm a 19-year-old male who's from a very rural county in Texas. My county was very large, however was full of farm fields and cattle, while also only having one little town inside, and it itself was very small. It's one of those towns that if you were to drive down the street, you would for sure see at least 4 to 5 people that you know. Anyway, within our town, we had your stereotypical abandoned homes that everyone would claim different scary things to, such as ghosts, murders, etc. You know, the classics. Well, when I was 15, someone had bought and moved into one of these houses, and it really surprised the town, as this house in question was incredibly old. Like, it's literally been there since before the Civil War, and everyone thought that it would never be bought again. Yet here's this guy that came out of nowhere and bought the house. My father, being part of the mayor's office, was very questionable about this man, as apparently after years later learning this, he had no identification with him. So it's pretty surprising to know that he somehow bought this house. Anyway, one night while my parents were on the couch, they told me that they were going west for a week and they were gonna leave me home alone. I was really excited about this, as my girlfriend at the time and I were starting to get more intimate, and this was the perfect opportunity for us. Fast forward a couple of weeks and into the home alone a week itself, and I'm sitting on the couch watching TV. As I'm sitting there, I flip to the local news channel, and I see that an escaped convict who was wanted for breaking and entering, sexual assault, pedophilia, and murder, and he had been spotted a couple of months ago just a few counties over. My mind then immediately flashed to the guy that randomly appeared and moved to the old abandoned home. That's when I got a notification that someone was at the door from the Ring app. I went to the door and opened it to see my girlfriend. Her and I made some food and then proceeded to get intimate. I won't go into details, but it didn't take long before we went to my room. As we're, doing this, I hear my phone go off, seeing another notification from the Ring app. I pretty much just ignored it, thinking it was just a deer or something, since they're pretty common in the area. But then, we heard a knock at the door. We both shot up from the bed, thinking it was her parents, after then realizing it was almost 2 a.m. That's when I checked my phone, and in my horror, I saw the guy that lived in the abandoned home on the camera. He was just standing in front of the door, peering inside through the window on the top of the door frame. My girlfriend and I quickly got dressed, then moved into the living room. I stood in front of the door very quietly, and I began to listen. Now, when I tell you this guy was breathing really loud, I mean it. He was breathing loud, like so loud that I could actually hear it from the other side of the door. Then after a few minutes, he began to knock. The knocking then turned into banging after maybe a couple of seconds, and he began to scream that he knew we were there, and he then demanded us to open the door. That's when I then went into fight or flight mode, and I shuffled my girlfriend up the stairs. I then went into my dad's office, which was on the 2nd floor, and I grabbed a handgun from the cabinet. My dad had taught me all about gun safety, so I knew what I was doing. I walked into my parents' room where my girlfriend was sitting, and she was absolutely bawling her eyes out at this point. I yelled at her to calm down and to call the police, and then go hide in my parents' closet. That's when we heard a window break downstairs, and then heard him scream, "You two better hope I don't find you, because I'm gonna hurt the both of you, and I'm gonna make you watch." This alone told me the man's intentions, so I primed the handgun, and I pointed it right at the door, as my girlfriend was now calling the police. Just then, the door to my parents' room started to bang as he was now trying to open it. I then screamed, "I have a handgun pointed to the door, and if you don't leave right now, I'm gonna pull the fucking trigger." The banging then stopped, and what followed scared the living shit out of me. The man then proceeded to laugh and then say, "Good, I have one of my own." I aimed my weapon right at the door, and I was preparing myself when I then heard the police sirens in the distance. I then heard the man on the other side quickly shuffle down the stairs and then out the door. The police arrived and questioned us and kept us company. My parents ended up flying home later that night and made a promise that they would never let this happen again. We moved not too long after that to Ohio, as my dad's company had an office in Columbus. The scary part, however, is after all these years, I decided to do some research, and I learned that the man was never actually caught and that he was last seen on that night. I really hope that after what he did to me, he at least left the country, or he was finally killed trying to break into someone else's home. But even to the time I'm writing this, there's still really a part of me that really wishes I had pulled that trigger.
This happened when I was home alone as a kid. It was the summertime, and I was home during summer break. Both my parents were at work, and I think I was about 12 years old. I have an older brother, and he went to one of his friends' houses that day. When I was home alone, I would just hang out and do whatever. Usually, I would go on the computer that we had and play Minecraft or something like that. It was probably sometime in the early afternoon, and I had been on the computer in the living room for a while. I moved into the kitchen to get something to eat. The kitchen was at the back side of the house, and we lived in a split level. I will also mention that the neighborhood was pretty average and a little bit on the quieter side. It was when I was standing in the kitchen that I saw something out the window. I just barely saw movement at first, but it looked like somebody was walking by. I moved over to another window to see. That's when I saw a man walking to the back side of the house. He was wearing a sort of construction vest and had a hat on. I realized that it must be the meter reader. I remember that they came around every so often to our house. I calmed down almost immediately. I had been a little worried seeing a guy walking into our backyard. He went to the very back side of our house and near one of the basement windows. I went back to finding some food in the kitchen. After I was in the kitchen for a good 5 minutes though, I looked over and noticed that the guy was still there. Usually, they would come and go really quick and only be there for like a minute at most. I went back into the living room to go back on the computer. But a short time later, I just had the feeling that I should get up and make sure that the man was now gone. Maybe it was because I was home alone and a kid, so I was a little bit paranoid. I carefully walked back over to the window and could see that the man was actually still there. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't tell exactly what he was doing because I could only see part of him from the angle that I was at, which was higher up than he was. He seemed to be doing something and was near the basement window, but I couldn't tell what exactly he was doing. I thought about going downstairs and looking out of that window, but I knew that the man would see me right away if I did. I went to walk over to another window upstairs, which would have a better angle, but I had to be careful so the guy wouldn't see me. Unfortunately, I really messed up. As I was walking over, I accidentally hit a can that was near the edge of a counter in the kitchen. I knocked it over and it fell onto the ground. This made a loud noise, and the next thing I knew, I saw the man quickly walking away. He moved back to the side of the house. I moved to the front of the house, and I watched the man casually walking down the street until I could no longer see him. I felt like he was really suspicious. I questioned whether he was even a meter reader or not. Why would he leave so suddenly like that? For the most part, though, I was just happy that he was now gone. I went back to the computer. I stayed there for the most part until my brother and parents came back home. When they did, I didn't even think to tell them about the guy that had been there. I thought he was gone for good. My brother's bedroom, as well as mine, happened to be in the basement, and my parents' bedroom was upstairs. Because it was summertime, we would stay up pretty much as late as we wanted. I remember that on this night, my parents went to bed, and my brother went down to his bedroom. I stayed up and was on the computer. All of the lights in the house were off, except for a small lamp in the living room near me. I stayed up on the computer until I got really tired, which was probably at about 1 a.m. Then, I turned off the lamp and went downstairs to go to bed. When I got downstairs, I had to walk past a little living room that was in the basement in order to get to my bedroom. As I was walking past, I happened to see something in the window. The man was back. I could only see a figure of a man, but I could guess who it was. This was the same window that he had been at earlier in the day. I then heard noises coming from the window, as if it was going to come open. I was suddenly really afraid. It was really dark down there, and I hit the light switch, which I happened to be really close to. When this happened, it lit up the whole room, and I could no longer see the man very well. I heard some noise from right outside the window though, and then it sounded like he was running away. I went running as well, but back upstairs into my parents' bedroom. I knocked on their door and yelled for them to wake up. About a minute later, my dad came out asking what was going on. By the time I explained it all, the man was long gone. My dad went out and inspected the house all around though. He was able to find that the back window the man kept messing with had quite a bit of damage. It had almost came off. It was like the man had been trying to remove the window and get inside the house, and he was really close to succeeding. After that night though, the man never came back. I remember being really scared for a while that he would, and I slept upstairs on the couch because I felt safer there. Luckily, he never did.